Okay, it's June 1st, 2021. We're in the side yard. You might hear the rainbirds of the field. You might hear the kids over doing their outside field day. Holly's swinging, and Dad's going to talk to us about his favorite books or books that he loves. I asked him to pick 3. How many you got?
Well, I couldn't decide on just 3. So then you said something about 7, so I tried to keep it to 7, but then I listed all my runner-ups, and there was like 11 of those. So
we've got 7
and 11,
and then 11 runner-ups.
Well,
okay.
and I didn't. When I like an author, I usually read all of the books by that author, but I didn't list any multiple books by any one author.
So you've got then 18
different authors.
Okay. And their favorite work.
And then the favorite work from that author.
But there might be lots worth reading on their backlists.
Yeah.
Okay,
so
here's number 1.
The first one, and do you want me to describe why I picked it?
Yes.
Okay, the first one I picked was Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. I put that on there because it's a very readable book, and he explains things very well for what he's trying to get across. I mean, even though it was written, 150 years ago or so, it holds up very well.
Does he describe the Beagle and the Galapagos Islands in much detail?
Not so much. Goes into a lot of other things. He goes into there's quite a lot in there about animal breeding, because you could modify. Obviously, it was well known that you could modify animals by selective breeding.
Right.
And so, his theory of adaptation and of selection, natural selection, was basically a way of we understand how you can change animals by manipulating them, with men manipulating them, but how could nature do that on its own without men involved?
Does he skirt the religious questions, or does he know what kind of can of worms he's opening?
He doesn't really skirt it. I mean, he
takes it on?
Not at all. Not at all. I mean, I think he tries to be a little bit sensitive because he's got family and that, but he
knows what he's saying.
But he makes it very clear what he's saying.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna read that one someday.
It's the second book I put down here was Age of Reason by Thomas Paine.
Okay.
It's during the important thinkers during the beginning of our country. I think it holds up really well in terms of explaining sort of the deist philosophy that a lot of our founding fathers had.
So was he writing that pre-revolution?
Yes, pretty much. I believe pre-revolution. I think some of it was actually written while he was over in Europe, but it certainly sparked the revolution in a lot of ways. But at the same time, it was very controversial.
Age of Reason.
It became controversial for many years later because of his attitude towards some things and his criticisms of dogmatism. Next book I put down here was Desert Solitaire by Edward Abbey. I first ran into Edward Abbey. Some park ranger guy recommended it, and I looked it up and got it. And
wait, when and where?
Oh, it was in one of the national parks, probably in the 70s.
So before your family came along?
Right, maybe around that time when they were starting. Maybe it was late 70s. But
so a ranger recommended.
Yeah, it was a ranger in a bookstore. He recommended. I know I talked to him a minute when I maybe about some interest, and he said you got to read some Edward Abbey, and I looked it up and got that. That was the first book I read, and of course I've read a lot of Edward Abbey since then. I mean, he's interesting to read, and I mean he's written novels in that, but I really this was the first book I read, and still the one I've gone back to and read multiple times.
Does he get in Desert Solitaire into some of his political philosophies, or is it mostly just a meditation on nature stuff?
He gets into his political philosophies, and you know where he's coming from. You definitely understand his environmental activism. It's not as out in front as say in the Monkey Wrench Gang, but it's certainly there. The next book I put on the list was Gödel, Escher, and Bach by Douglas Hofstadter. I was browsing in a bookstore, I think in Cornell, when I think it was Cornell, when I was back there to a conference, and just ran across the book, and it looked interesting. And
when you were in graduate school?
No, this was on a work trip.
Oh, okay.
It was a conference I was going back to.
Like a computer conference.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
who's the author again?
Douglas Hofstadter.
Okay. Sorry, go ahead. What?
Anyway, it's a book that I've enjoyed reading, but it's also, it's also technical and mathematical in some ways, but he covers a lot of things and brings connections between a lot of things, and that's very interesting the way he connects things together.
So I know Escher, he's referring to the artist, and Bach's the musician. Who's Gödel?
He's a mathematician that in the 1830s he proved an important theorem about mathematics being incomplete.
And always incomplete?
Well, essentially, you can't have either it's inconsistent or it's incomplete. It can't be both. A mathematical system, if it's rich enough to include the integers, basically, then it can't be both complete and consistent. And of course, sort of a running theme throughout the book is self-reference.
So is Gödel, is that Mobius strip part of that?
Well, he works that in ways, because it's sort of a self-referential idea with the Mobius strip, but a lot of Escher's sketches are self-referential.
Right.
I mean that's why he included them as one of the three.
Is Bach's music self-referential too, just because it plays on the same themes?
Yeah, it especially the fugues, and he goes into a lot of the fugues. The next book I put down here was The Selfish Gene by Dawkins. It sort of a more recent take on evolutionary theory. He explains it very well. It's been a very influential book, but it's a little bit dated now. A lot has happened in that field since then, but he very much takes a gene-centric point of view in explaining evolution, which really it's the genes that are in control and that are trying to survive and replicate. That's, and you often, if you take that gene-centric point of view, you can understand things a lot better, and that's kind of what he explains in that book.
But he's also very much putting forward his atheism in that book, right?
Not so much in that book. He in other books he gets into it a lot more. I mean,
but part of the big point is you don't need anything besides evolutionary biology to explain the complexity of everything from an eyeball.
Maybe another book by his that kind of goes in that direction more explicitly is The Blind Watchmaker, where he explains, how you can, complex things can evolve in without any in a natural way, with natural phenomena.
Without a watchmaker.
Without a watchmaker. The next book I put on here is the Tao is Silent by Smolian, Richard Smolian. I enjoyed reading that, and I've read it several times since, because it was one of my first introduction to Eastern thought and Eastern way of thinking about ideas and a very non-dogmatic approach to religion, and that was kind of something that was very refreshing.
Start reading some of those, or
Smolian,
become interested?
I probably read in the 70s or early 80s.
Was that the 7th?
No, that was the 6th.
Okay.
The next one I put on here was Mountain Meadow Massacre by Juanita Brooks. I wanted to include it because I read a lot of history books, Mormon history books, and this was one of the first. Well, I think the first I read that was that where I understood that you could write and there were historians actually writing Mormon history in an honest, trying to be honest about it, and she was a pioneer in many ways, and I found that book on my dad's bookshelf.
Oh.
And
do you think he read it? So
I imagine he read it.
I didn't realize it was that old.
Oh yeah, it was written in the I'm guessing a little bit here, but in the 50s.
So if it was written in the 1950s, did she interview survivors?
I don't know if we want to get off a little bit, but no, she didn't. But Juanita Brooks was started off as a school teacher in Bunkerville, Nevada, and she had an interest in history, and people knew that she did, and there was an older gentleman that was nearby in one of the communities, probably in the same stake, and people recommended or encouraged her to go talk to him because he had important things to say about some history. And it turns out that she found out she never followed through and interviewed him and talked to him, but she found out later on he was there. and it would have been a
Great
perfect
interview.
opportunity, but it was one of those failed connections. So, yeah. So, of anybody that was actually there and participated in the massacre, I don't think she ever actually was. They were pretty much gone.
So I haven't read it, but I'm just curious. One more thing. So my understanding is that they dressed up like Indians to do it. Is that, did she report
that what I
that?
told you is not in the book. But I've read her an autobiography and a biography of Juanita Brooks.
Okay.
But so
I mean, was she telling that part of the story? Is that true, that the people that committed the massacre, they dressed up like Indians?
yeah, it's in there.
I didn't know if that was more recent or if she was already talking about that.
Well, it's they involved the Indians to some extent, but the Indians were too smart to really get involved and do the dirty work that the Mormons wanted done. And so when they actually massacred them, they weren't dressed up as Indians at that time. They were basically saying that they were going to lead them, that they had called a truce with the Indians. That was the guys, and that they were going to lead them out single file to a safe location.
Oh.
But the whole idea was they'd get them in a single file, and then all of a sudden they would do the.
So it was like exploiting the travelers' fear of the Indians.
Yeah.
So now on to the 11 runners up.
Yeah. Okay. I wanted to include at least one novel, because I do read things other than nonfiction occasionally, and the one I decided to include was Big Rock Candy Mountain by Wallace Stegner. I've read a lot of Stegner's works, and some fiction, some nonfiction, but this is a fiction book that he wrote early on that's really good. It has a lot of local connections in it, so it has that flavor to it. But I enjoyed it. I think I've read it a couple times.
And that's the only novel?
That's the only novel. I thought of including some others. I have kind of a guilty pleasure. I like to read missioners' books.
Okay.
I enjoyed The Source.
Yep.
But for some reason, I don't know why I call him a guilty pleasure, but that's kind of the way I feel, because he's so. It's one of the few authors that are commercially popular that I read.
Well, he hasn't been putting out new work for a while. I don't even know if he's alive.
I don't think he's not alive now.
Yeah, James Michener. Okay.
Yeah. But we'll keep an eye on her. But I didn't put it on the list. I also, there's a few others. I recently read Les Mis. And I've read the Brothers Karamazov. But I thought this was the one that I decided upon, because I've read several of his works of fiction, and I figured since I've gone back to him a number of times,
Well, I'm glad you picked that one of his, because I read all of another one of them and didn't like it that much. So maybe I'll give him another shot.
The next one I put on here might seem rather strange, but The C Programming Language by Kernighan and Ritchie. I don't think it's a book for everybody, but for me, it was the right book at the right time. I learned to program using other languages and that, and I never really. It was just a hackish way to earn a living, but I actually understood that there's some real beauty and discipline to programming, and I sort of got that idea or from reading.
So you
that
read
book.
this after you'd been programming for a while.
And I actually probably while I probably read it when I started to learn C, when I transitioned, and I was a C programmer for quite a while. I mean, for a number of years, way back when. But it was. I still think it's a very well written. Most programming books are not that interesting to read. But this was, I think, if he packed a lot into it, and you had to read it carefully. It read like a math book in some ways in that regard. The next one I put on the list was Black Holes and Time Warps by Kip Thorne.
A physicist?
He's a physicist, and he actually, did most of his career. He was at Caltech, but he was raised in Utah County, and so he does have a local connection that I find interesting.
Is he the same one that did the Quark and the Jaguar? I feel like I read something.
That was different.
So this one's called Black Holes and what?
Time Warps.
We have just had Poppy pull off Dad's microphone. Sit down, girl.
So I included it on here. I think it's dated. I mean, it's a little bit older now. I mean, there's obviously a lot of physics been since he wrote that, but it's still an interesting book to read. The next one I put on here is I had to include one book by Oliver Sacks. So the one I put on here was The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat.
I've read more of them from your run-ups than your first list. Yeah.
Anyway, so I think there's a lot of his books I've read, and I think that one I like the different case histories. Almost each of them stands alone and very, very, very well. That he writes in that book.
I like how the kind of edge extreme cases, though, he makes illuminate more universal psychology insights. The
next one is a book that I used as a textbook as a undergraduate when I was a senior. It's kind of when I decided to be serious about going ahead and going to graduate school and getting in studying mathematics. And it was I took a 500 level algebra course, and they used for the textbook Topics in Algebra, and it's one of the few math texts I have that's actually readable. Most math texts are good for the problems, and that's about all. But this was I've hung on to it. I bought the newer edition when it was available.
It was for a 500 level algebra course, and it helped kind of solidify your choice to continue in graduate school.
And I when I was in graduate school, I took a lot more algebra than probably any other thing. Algebra and analysis, topology. I mean, it sort of influenced kind of what I studied. So. Next one I put on the list is Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman by Richard Feynman. And it's just a hoot. It's one of the few books that I started to read. I mean, I'm not a very fast reader. I kind of read it silently but out loud to myself. So
that's your pace.
That's about the pace I read.
Mm-hmm.
And I read this. I couldn't put it down. I read it from cover to cover one night.
So much personality.
Because it was so interesting
and funny
and
just good.
Just a belly laugh all over the place. The next one I have on here is Great Basin Kingdom by Arrington. I've read a lot of Arrington's books.
So another
there's a
Mormon
few other I
history.
could have put on here, but by him, but I chose this one. It's one of the stories about that book that I think is kind of interesting is he there was a professor, I think at BYU, that had used the text, used it as a text in one of the classes he was teaching, the Great Basin Kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the class, there was 30 or 40 students in the class, and he asked the class who they thought, whether they thought the author of the book was LDS or not.
And
it was almost evenly split. Arrington wasn't famous. He wasn't church historian at the time, obviously, and so nobody really. He was just a professor up at Utah State, and so and not well known, because this is the first history book that he wrote. And Arrington, when he found that out, when later on when the professor told him, he says that I think I struck about the right balance. I mean, when.
So was that book about the settlement of the Salt Lake Valley?
It's about the economic history of early Utah and the endeavors. Most of them failed of trying to grow cotton in the south, trying to get ironworks going in the Cedar City area, trying to get sugar beets going in Idaho. And I mean, it's about a lot of the economic missteps and positive steps that the saints took
very early,
and basically covering the 19th century period. Next book I got on here is The River That Flows Uphill by William Calvin. I can't remember how I stumbled onto that book, but I thought it was great book. I've read a lot of Calvin's books since then, and I've gone back and reread this one. I've tried to get Stephen to read it, but
so he talks about the history of life and Earth by tracing his journey down the Grand Canyon on the river, and the deeper he goes, the farther back we go. Is that right?
The reason he calls it the river that runs uphill is because the further you go down the river, you're actually going forward in time.
Oh, so you're going, okay. You're getting closer to now as you go down the river.
Yes, you're not going back, you're going forward. But
so wait, that was why you wanted to have a journey down that river.
Nice strawberries. I picked them myself.
Thank you.
I was talking to Catherine about a little while ago about wanting to go down and not so much a river trip, but I don't know, but stay at the North Rim Lodge, like we did at the Old Faithful Lodge. But I think reservations are like years out.
I should get some then, huh?
I was even thinking about calling Jose and seeing if I can get some reservations if he wants to go.
Has he never visited the Grand Canyon?
No. And
Mommy, what's Dad's middle name?
Dad's middle name is Scott, but I need you to go back with Nana for a bit, okay? We got to talk about 4 more books, I think.
I think 3 more on here. The next one I put on here is this is one of the books by one of the horsemen, or one of the other horsemen. Darwin's Dangerous Idea by Daniel Dennett. That little thing came off. It clips it on, but
oh, there it is. So wait, you call them the horsemen? You mean the great atheists or the great evolutionary biologists?
Well, they call him. I don't know who labeled him the horseman, but
so Dawkins, Darwin.
No, Dawkins,
Dennett,
Dawkins, Dennett,
Who's the other one that's kind of outspoken atheist? That
Harris is one of them.
Sam Harris?
Yes,
Oh,
he's considered one of them. And the other one is, he passed away, Hutchins.
yeah, Hutchins. He's
Yeah.
the very
He's very
outspoken one.
outspoken, and you'd probably really like his politics. He's very
Little libertarian.
little libertarian and conservative. He was.
Hutchins. I didn't know there was 4 horsemen.
I don't know who labeled them that way, but they all came out with books within a couple years of each other, maybe even less time than that.
Criticizing religion.
Criticizing religion and making a case for
So which Dennett book did you put in?
Darwin's Dangerous Idea.
And I forgot, I think I've read that, but he talks about kind of the history of Darwin's life and then what happened with the...
It's not just about Darwin's
science.
life, but about how the whole idea of natural selection can be applied in a lot of areas, even other than biology and that. And as I remember. Next book I put on here was Wonderful Life by Stephen Jay Gould. It's I've read a lot of his books too, but it's the one that covers the discoveries around the Burgess shell and sort of the rediscovery, because they dug them all up and then they put them away, and it wasn't until he went back in. I mean, it wasn't Gould himself, but he writes about those that kind of went back and rediscovered what they had found in the Burgess shell and the early Cambrian explosion. And the last one I've got on the list here is Year 501, The Conquest Continues by Noam Chomsky. Of his books, I like that one.
What does 501 refer to? The since Columbus?
It was written in the 501 year of
After 1492.
after 1492, so it would have been in 1993, I guess, when he wrote it.
So Chomsky, a social critic, borderline anarchist, who's still alive.
Yeah.
I saw him in a video YouTube podcast the other day.
He's certainly getting up there in age, but he's still alive.
So a couple more questions. What books are you reading right now? Or what do you like reading now?
Oh, I've got a book on my reader, my e-reader, that is let's see. It's who is it? I think. It's by the physicist, the one that's popular. You see him on TV all the time. That's black.
Tyson?
Yeah.
Neil deGrasse Tyson?
Neil deGrasse Tyson. It's a series of interviews he does. It's kind of light reading, but I've got that one and another related book both on there that I'm reading. Then that's kind of what I'm reading right now.
Are there any authors that you still get excited when they publish something new?
Yeah, there's authors. I didn't include one here, but he still writes books occasionally. The one that wrote
Pinker?
Well, Pinker's one, I guess. That's not the one I was thinking. I was thinking of the one that writes about innovation. I'm sure you've read
Ridley? No.
Ridley. Yeah,
Is that?
Matt Ridley.
Yeah.
I would definitely read something he puts out.
And then if
He's also politically very conservative.
I know.
I guess maybe you figured that out.
I know. So the last question is, how would you just describe or talk about the role of your reading life in your life? The role of books.
Well, the authors I read, where I read multiple books or kind of everything they write, I almost think sometimes that I mean, you don't know them personally, but you almost feel like you know them, and so you have an intimacy with those authors that I don't think that I don't have probably with a lot of people. In fact, when I was making this, as I was talking to Catherine about it, and I included on the top of the list on the first 7, Mountain Meadow Massacre, and I kind of thought, well, you know, I've certainly read a lot of Arrington's books, and you know, should I include one of his on the top of the list? And I told Catherine, I says, but I'm sure Arrington would be fine with it, because I know him, and I know he would be.
Right. Well, and I think compared to me or to Mom, you're not quite as much of an escapist reader, like with your pace and reading so much nonfiction. It's not really what you do to decompress and relax.
Where's Nana?
I don't know. Go look for her.
I don't know where she is.
Go look inside the house.
I did.
Okay. Just sit for a minute.
Yeah, I don't read that way. Catherine will read sometimes, like to fall asleep.
Yeah.
I generally don't read in bed. Occasionally I have that reader and that, but when I read, and when I put the book down, I don't read. But
yeah. Okay. Any last thoughts?
Nope.
Here's mine. I teaching and just like books in general, I sometimes get trapped into this belief that unless someone is reading a lot of fiction for recreation, like I did, they can't really become strong, good readers. But Mike doesn't read that way, and I don't think Jack is going to read that way. He likes his information, and that's just fine. It's a different way to be a reader. Okay, that's all. Bye, everybody.
The series of books that I read, I remember I was in like 7th and 8th grade, and I'd go to the library in junior high, and they had this series of books called All About, and then it would be like rocks or geology or something, you know. They were generally science type things, but you know, I remember checking just about all of that series out and reading it because I
Liked information.
because and obviously that was nonfiction, and I wasn't reading fiction even back then a whole lot. I read a few.
Hey, get that out of your mouth.
I read a few. A lot of the fiction I did, and a lot of it I enjoyed, but it was like assigned stuff. I mean, you know, you had to read, you know, the
like in high
Scarlet
school.
Letter. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
and I still remember that, and still enjoyed the book. And I read some Jack London when I was a kid. I probably did that more on my own. That was I liked Call of the Wild, and I read a few other of Jack London's works when I was younger.
I turned it back on so we could get this part. Okay, we'll really be done now.
Okay.